My dad said, "You're not family anymore." Hi, my name is Cassandra. Cassie, to the people who actually love me. I'm 27 years old. I live in a sunlit apartment in Portland, Oregon, with my rescue cat named Fig and a window box full of herbs I actually remember to water. I have a job I'm proud of, friends who show up when I'm sick, and a life that feels, for the first time in my adult memory, genuinely mine. And I built every single piece of it on the rubble of the day my father looked me in the eyes across the Thanksgiving table and said, "You're not family anymore." I remember the exact feeling. Not devastation. Not shock. Something quieter and more dangerous than either of those things. Relief. Because the moment he said it out loud, I realized I finally had permission to agree. This is the story of how I lost my family, and discovered that losing them was the greatest thing that ever happened to me. But before we get to that moment, before we get to what I found out, what I did, and why my father now calls my old cell number that I disconnected 2 years ago, you need to understand where I came from. I grew up in Clover Falls, a small town in Ohio that sounds more charming than it was. My parents, Dennis and Maureen Whitfield, had 3 children. My older brother, Tyler, who was 2 years ahead of me. And then my younger sister, Brianna, the baby, who arrived when I was 6 and immediately became the entire emotional center of the household. Tyler was the firstborn son, so he got a different kind of attention, the pressured, performance-based kind. Dad pushed him hard in baseball, in grades, in everything. Tyler coped by becoming exactly what Dad wanted on the surface and completely chaotic underneath. He partied through high school, scraped by, and still got celebrated at every family dinner like he'd built a cathedral with his bare hands. Brianna was the baby. Brianna was beautiful in a way that made strangers stop in grocery stores. Brianna cried easily and laughed loudly and took up space like she was born knowing the room belonged to her. Mom called her our little light. She called me our practical one. At the time, I thought that was a compliment. It took me until I was 24 to understand that practical was my family's word for the one we don't have to worry about, which really meant the one we don't have to think about at all. My role in that family was quiet and functional. I got good grades without anyone asking. I stayed out of trouble without anyone monitoring. When I was 15 and Dad lost his job at the auto parts manufacturer, I started babysitting 3 nights a week and slipping cash into the grocery envelope on the kitchen counter because I'd overheard my parents whispering about the electric bill. I never told them it was me. I don't think it occurred to them to wonder. Tyler's college applications were funded by my parents taking out a second loan on the house. Mine were funded by 3 part-time jobs and every scholarship I could apply for. When I got a full academic scholarship to University of Oregon, paid in full, nothing needed from them, my mother said, "Well, that's a relief." My father said, "Good. We needed that money for Bree's dance competitions anyway." I drove to Oregon with everything I owned in the backseat of a 2009 Honda Civic I'd bought myself and didn't look in the rearview mirror until I crossed the state line. I want to be fair, because I'm not someone who paints everyone in my past as a monster. My parents loved us, in the way that people who've never examined themselves love, reflexively, selectively, without awareness of how the love lands on the person receiving it. But love without awareness still causes damage. And the damage in my family had been accumulating for years before it finally broke the surface. The first real crack showed up when I was 22, a year out of college, working as a junior accountant at a firm in Portland. It was April, and I got a call from my mother with that specific careful tone she used when she needed something. "Your father's truck needs a new transmission," she said. "It's going to be $4,000. You're the one with the steady job, Cassie." I was 22. I was paying rent in one of the most expensive cities on the West Coast. I was making $38,000 a year before taxes, still paying down the last of my student loans on the small gap my scholarship hadn't covered. "Mom," I said carefully, "I don't have $4,000 just sitting." "Tyler's going through some things right now," she said, as if I hadn't spoken. "And Brianna's recital season is so expensive. You understand how it is." I understood. I also understood that this wouldn't be the last time. I was right. Over the next 3 years, there were 8 separate requests for money. 8. 2 for Tyler, who had racked up credit card debt he never explained. 4 for Brianna, whose dance ambitions had by then expanded into a plan to move to Los Angeles that somehow required my financial participation. And 2 for my parents themselves, 1 for that truck, 1 for a medical bill that turned out to be for a procedure my mother had chosen to have done out of network at a facility she preferred aesthetically. The total across those 3 years was just over $14,000. I gave it. Every time. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself it was love in action. I told myself that they would do the same for me. Then, at 25, I had a car accident. Nothing life-threatening, a bad intersection, a driver running a red light, a totaled car and a fractured wrist that kept me out of work for 6 weeks. Short-term disability covered some of it. Not all of it. I called my mother and told her what happened. She said, "Oh no, sweetheart, are you okay?" And then, in the same breath, "The timing is actually really tricky right now. Bri just signed her lease in LA and we helped with the deposit, so we're a little stretched." I said, "Mom, I'm asking for help. Not a loan. Just help." She said she'd talk to Dad. She called back 3 days later to say Dad thought I should look into an emergency personal loan through my credit union. I hung up the phone, sat on my bathroom floor with my wrist in its brace, and cried for about 40 minutes. Then I got up, washed my face, called my friend Dominique, who showed up with groceries and stayed the whole weekend, and started quietly, carefully, rethinking everything. That was the beginning of what I now privately call my education. I didn't blow up. I didn't confront anyone. I did something that was, for me, more powerful. I started paying attention. I started keeping records. Nothing dramatic. I'm an accountant. Documentation is literally my first language. I went back through my bank statements and recorded every transfer I'd made to family members. $14,260 over 3 years. I wrote it in a spreadsheet. I saved every text exchange where a request had been made. I wrote summaries of the phone conversations while they were fresh. I also started talking to a therapist named Dr. Paula Reeves, who had an office near my work and a very calm way of asking questions that made the inside of my skull feel like it was being gently rearranged. She was the one who first said the word enmeshment to me. She was the one who explained, with careful clinical language, the dynamic I had been living inside my entire life. That I had been assigned the role of family resource, not family member. That my competence had been used against me. That my independence had been framed as a reason to need me less while asking me for more. "They've trained you to see your own needs as inconvenient," she said one afternoon. "Have you noticed that?" I sat with that for a long time. I also, during this period, happened to have a conversation that would turn out to be more important than I knew at the time. I was home for Christmas, one of my last attempts at a normal holiday, and I ran into my great-aunt Sylvia at my grandmother's church event. Sylvia was my grandmother Nora's younger sister, sharp as a tack at 78, with an opinion on everything and the courage to voice it. We ended up in a corner with cups of terrible church coffee, and she said, out of nowhere, "Your grandmother thinks about you, you know. She worries about whether you're getting your fair share." I smiled and said something vague about being fine. Sylvia tilted her head. "She's updated her arrangements, you know. Last year. After your grandfather passed." A pause. She wanted to make sure the right people were taken care of. I didn't know what to do with that, so I filed it away and caught my flight back to Portland. 6 months later, my grandmother Nora passed away peacefully in her sleep. She was 81, sharp-minded until the end, and the only member of my family of origin who had ever looked at me like I was a complete person rather than a utility. I flew home for the funeral. I sat in the front row and cried real tears. Afterward, at the reception at my parents' house, I overheard my father and Tyler talking quietly in the kitchen. "Sylvia said the will already went through the lawyer," Tyler was saying. "What did she leave you?" "Some jewelry for your mother," Dad said. "The china set. And he lowered his voice. I stopped moving. "She left the house to Cassie," he said. "And the savings account." Said Cassie was the only one she trusted to be responsible with it. A long silence. "Cassie," Tyler said. His voice had something sharp in it. Your grandmother was sentimental, Dad said. We'll figure it out. I stood completely still on the other side of that wall and thought, figure it out. And I knew, with the deep animal instinct of someone who had been underestimated her entire life, that whatever they were planning to figure out was not going to be in my interest. I went back to Portland 2 days later. I called my grandmother's estate attorney, a woman named Margaret Holloway, before my suitcase was even unpacked. The inheritance was real. My grandmother's house, a modest 3-bedroom in Clover Falls, and a savings account with a little over $60,000. She had written me a letter that the attorney read to me over the phone in a steady professional voice that only slightly wavered at the end. Cassandra, it said, you were always the one who gave without being asked and asked for nothing in return. I see you, sweetheart. I always did. I had to put the phone down for a minute. Margaret told me the will was airtight. Notarized, witnessed, updated 14 months prior. She also told me, with the careful tone of someone who had been around families long enough to recognize predatory behavior, there may be an attempt to contest. I want you to be prepared. She did not know how right she was. 2 weeks after I spoke to Margaret, my father called me. He was warm. Warmer than he'd been in years, actually. He asked about my job, my apartment, my cat. He had never once asked about my cat before. He didn't even know the cat's name. We need to talk about Mom's mother's estate, he said eventually, with the practiced casualness of someone who had rehearsed this sentence. As a family. Okay, I said. You know, your grandmother, God rest her, she wasn't always thinking clearly toward the end. We all saw it. Her memory wasn't. Dad, I said, I spoke to Margaret Holloway. The will is legally sound. A pause. Well, naturally we'd want a second opinion. I've already retained her, I said. She's my attorney now. Another pause. Longer. Cassie. His voice shifted. Something harder underneath. That money belongs to this family. Your grandmother didn't understand what she was doing. She was old and she was lonely and you were the one calling her, so of course she knew exactly what she was doing, I said. She always did. You're being selfish, he said. You've always had a selfish streak. We tried to raise you better than this. I thought about $14,000. I thought about a fractured wrist and a credit union suggestion. I thought about a car I drove to Oregon without anyone watching me go. I'll be in touch through Margaret, I said, and ended the call. Thanksgiving that year was the last time I went home. I know now that I shouldn't have gone. But something in me, some old hopeful part of me that hadn't finished grieving the family I'd wanted them to be, needed to try one more time. Needed to look them in the eye and see if any version of repair was possible. It wasn't. The moment I walked in, I felt the atmosphere. Tyler barely looked at me. Brianna gave me a hug that was 2 seconds too short and then disappeared into her phone. My mother was over-cheerful in the way she got when she was anxious and performing normalcy for an audience. My father was quiet. We made it through appetizers. We made it through most of dinner. Then my father set down his fork and said, "We've spoken to an attorney." I kept my face still. "Have you?" "There are grounds to challenge the will," he said. "Undue influence. You were calling her constantly, building a relationship specifically to manipulate a vulnerable old woman." "I called my grandmother because I loved her," I said. "You called her because you knew she had money," Tyler said. He didn't look up from his plate when he said it. The table went quiet. "Tyler," my mother said weakly. "It's true, Mom. We're all thinking it." I looked at my brother. I looked at him for a long moment, this man I had shared a childhood with, whose debt I had helped pay, who I had never once asked anything from, and I felt something in me go very still and very clear. "I want you to hear this," I said to the table. I kept records. Every dollar I sent to each of you, with dates and text confirmations. $14,000 over 3 years. I have documentation of every request. If you pursue legal action against my grandmother's estate, I will countersue for the full amount in small claims and civil court, and I will make sure that every document becomes part of the public record. My father stood up. His chair scraped back. His face was red. You would do that to your own family. You started this, I said quietly. After everything we gave you. What did you give me, Dad? I asked. Not angry. Genuinely asking. I'd really like specifics. His jaw worked. Nothing came out. You're not family anymore, he said finally. Low and furious. You hear me? You're done. You're not a Whitfield. You're not my daughter. You're nothing. I picked up my napkin from my lap, folded it, and set it on the table. Okay, I said. I stood up, got my coat from the rack by the door, and walked out into the cold November air. I sat in my rental car for a moment. The house lights were warm yellow through the curtains. I drove away. My father's attorney sent a letter in January. Margaret responded within the week. The challenge to the will was formally filed in February and dismissed by March. The will was, as Margaret had assured me, legally impeccable, and the claims of undue influence had no supporting evidence beyond the fact that I had been close to my grandmother, which is not, it turns out, a legal argument. I sold the house in Clover Falls. It wasn't a fortune, $112,000 after fees and the small remaining mortgage my grandmother had. Combined with the savings account, I had enough to make a significant payment on a property of my own. I bought a small house in a neighborhood I love. I have a backyard where Fig sits in the sun and knocks over my herb pots with tremendous satisfaction. I left my father's family's last name off my professional profiles. Not changed, legally, that felt like more energy than they deserved, just quietly absent from places they might search. They tried to reach me several times in the first year. My father called 4 times. Brianna sent a long text in July that began with "I've been doing a lot of thinking" and ended with a request for a loan to cover a gap in her LA rent. Tyler sent a Christmas card with no note inside, just his signature, like a business card dropped into my life. I didn't respond to any of it. Dominique hosted Christmas that year. 12 people, mismatched chairs, 3 different desserts, a dog that ate an entire plate of brownies and survived. It was the best Christmas of my adult life. 2 years out now, and I want to tell you what I've learned, because this story isn't really about my father or the money or the will. Those are the events. The story is about something underneath them. I used to think that being the responsible one, the capable one, the one who didn't need anything, I thought that was something to be proud of. I thought it was a character trait. Now I understand it was a survival strategy so thoroughly internalized that I had mistaken it for my personality. I had built my identity around being low maintenance for people who never deserved my maintenance to begin with. Dr. Reeves helped me understand that grief is part of this, real grief, for the parents I needed and didn't have, for the childhood where someone should have been watching out for me and mostly wasn't. I've done that work. I'm still doing it. It doesn't make me bitter. It makes me honest. If you're in a family where you are the one who gives and asks for nothing, where your strength is used as a reason to neglect you, where your love is treated as a resource to be extracted, I want you to hear this: that is not love. That is not family. Family is what you build with people who choose you back. My name is Cassandra. I'm 27 years old. I live in a house I bought myself, in a city I chose, surrounded by people who have never once made me feel like my needs were an inconvenience. And somewhere in Ohio, my father calls a disconnected number and wonders why I don't answer. I hope the silence teaches him something. I'm not holding my breath. But I am, for the first time in my life, completely, entirely, at peace.